There is a word that needs correcting before this story begins. Lost. The Maya were never lost. Their descendants, approximately 7 million people speaking 32 distinct Mayan languages across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, have been living continuously in the same landscapes where their ancestors built their cities for the past 3,000 years. The communities of the Yucatan Peninsula still practice ceremonies that connect them directly to the religious traditions of the classic Maya. The farmers of highland Guatemala still plant their corn according to the 260-day ritual calendar that Mayan astronomers developed more than 2,000 years ago. The weavers of Cayapas still produce textiles in patterns that archaeological evidence connects to pre-Columbian traditions stretching back centuries. The Maya were not lost. What was lost, temporarily, to the specific narrow perspective of European and American scholarship, was the understanding of what the Maya had built and what the Maya had known. The jungle-covered ruins that 19th-century explorers found in the forests of the Yucatan and Guatemala and Belize were not abandoned mysteries without living context. They were the archaeological remains of a civilization whose descendants were standing right next to the archaeologists, watching them dig, and whose oral traditions and ceremonial practices and agricultural knowledge contained more information about those ruins than any amount of excavation could provide. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the Mayan rediscovery, that it was, from the beginning, a story about European ignorance rather than Mayan disappearance, and that the gradual recovery of Mayan historical knowledge over the past 2 centuries has been, in its most productive phases, a story of collaboration between archaeologists and the living Maya communities whose ancestors built what the archaeologists were studying. With that essential correction made, the story of how the wider world came to understand the extraordinary achievement of Mayan civilization is itself one of the most fascinating stories in the entire history of archaeology. It involves amateur explorers hacking through jungle with machetes, a diplomat's wife who cracked one of the most complex writing systems in the ancient world, a Russian-American scholar who spent decades in Mexico being dismissed by his colleagues, a German anthropologist who recognized in the Mayan calendar a mathematical sophistication that put European medieval calendars to shame, and the specific slow accumulation of understanding that transformed the Maya in the scholarly imagination from a peaceful astronomical society to a warlike empire builder to something considerably more complex and more interesting than either simplified version. The Maya civilization is not a single entity with a clear beginning and a clear end. It is a cultural and linguistic tradition that spans approximately 3,000 years, from the pre-classic period beginning around 2000 BCE, through the extraordinary flowering of the classic period from approximately 250 CE to 900 CE, through the post-classic period that followed the classic collapse and continued until the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, and through the colonial and modern periods in which Mayan cultural traditions have persisted, transformed, and in some respects revived. At its peak, in the classic period, from roughly the 3rd to the 10th centuries CE, the Maya world was the most intellectually sophisticated civilization in the Americas. The city-states that covered the lowland jungle of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala and Belize were home to populations of hundreds of thousands of people. Their monuments and their writing systems and their astronomical observations and their mathematical achievements placing them in the company of the great civilizations of the ancient world. The mathematics. The Mayan mathematical system was a positional vigesimal system, base 20 rather than the base 10 of the European tradition, that included the concept of 0 as a placeholder and an arithmetic value. 0. The number that medieval European mathematics did not have and whose absence hobbled European calculation for centuries. The Maya had it. Independently of India, which developed 0 at approximately the same time in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, the Maya had developed the concept of 0 as an essential element of their numerical system by at least the 4th century CE and possibly earlier. The specific intellectual achievement of recognizing that nothing is a number, that the absence of quantity can be expressed as a quantity, is one of the most important conceptual breakthroughs in the history of mathematics. The Maya made it. The astronomy. The Mayan astronomical tradition, conducted entirely with naked eye observations, without telescopes, without any optical instruments, using the specific precision of long-term systematic observation accumulated across generations of trained observers, achieved a knowledge of celestial mechanics that rivals anything produced by the pre-telescopic astronomical traditions of the Old World. The Mayan calculation of the length of the solar year, 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 45 seconds, was accurate to within about 17 seconds of the modern measurement. Their calculation of the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, was accurate to within 2 hours over a 500-year period. The calendars. The Maya did not have a calendar. They had multiple interlocking calendar systems operating simultaneously, the 365-day solar calendar, the 260-day ritual calendar, and the long count calendar that tracked time from a mythological creation date and that was capable of expressing dates tens of thousands of years in the future and the past. The intersection of the solar calendar and the ritual calendar created a 52-year cycle, the calendar round, in which no 2 days had the same combined designation. The long count calendar created a cycle of approximately 5,125 years, a BAK-ton, whose most recent completion on December 21, 2012, generated the apocalyptic popular speculation that the Maya had predicted the end of the world, a misreading of the Mayan calendar so fundamental and so persistent that it required years of patient correction by Mayan scholars and by the living Maya communities themselves. The writing. The Mayan writing system, one of only 5 independently invented writing systems in the entire history of human civilization, is a logosyllabic script in which some signs represent whole words and some signs represent syllables, and in which the same word can be written in multiple different ways using different combinations of logographic and syllabic signs. It was inscribed on stone monuments, painted on ceramic vessels, written in bark paper books, and carved on the wooden lintels of temple doorways. It recorded history and genealogy and astronomical calculations and religious ritual and political propaganda and the specific everyday details of royal life. The Spanish destroyed most of it. In 1562, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa, who would later write one of the most important documents for the eventual decipherment of the Mayan script, ordered the burning of every Mayan book he could find at a ceremony in the town of Mani in the Yucatan. He burned hundreds of books. He burned the accumulated written knowledge of centuries of Mayan scholarship. He called it an act of God. It was one of the most catastrophic acts of deliberate cultural destruction in the history of human civilization. 4 Mayan books survived. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and a possible 4th, the Grolier Codex, whose authenticity was disputed for decades but is now generally accepted. 4 books from a tradition that had produced hundreds, possibly thousands. The Maya who survived the conquest and the epidemics and the forced labor and the specific comprehensive violence of Spanish colonialism continued their traditions orally and ceremonially and in the memory woven into the fabric of their daily lives. But the written record, the books, was almost entirely gone. The physical ruins of the great Mayan cities were not hidden from the Spanish. The conquistadors and the colonial missionaries who followed them into the Yucatan encountered the ruins of Chichen Itza and Uxmal and the other great post-classic cities and recorded them in the documents of the colonial period. Diego de Landa himself, the book burner, wrote an account of Yucatan, the Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan, that contained the most important single document for the eventual decipherment of the Mayan script, his imperfect but essential recording of the Mayan alphabet as explained to him by a Mayan noble. The colonial documents contain extensive information about Mayan culture and history, gathered by the same colonial apparatus that was simultaneously destroying that culture and history. The deeper jungle cities of the classic Maya, Palenque, Copan, Tikal, Calakmul, Caracol, Yaxcalan, Quirigua, were less immediately accessible to the Spanish colonial world, and their ruins were covered by the growth of 5 centuries of tropical forest by the time the 19th century exploration tradition began the systematic investigation of Mesoamerican antiquity. John Lloyd Stephens was an American diplomat and travel writer, born in 1805 in New Jersey, a lawyer by training and a traveler by vocation, whose journeys to the Middle East and to Greece and to Eastern Europe had established him as one of the most widely read travel writers in America. He heard about the Mayan ruins of Central America from the existing colonial documents and from the first reports of 19th-century travelers, and in 1839 he set out with a British artist named Frederick Catherwood to find them. Catherwood was the perfect partner for Stephens, a trained architectural draftsman whose experience drawing the monuments of Egypt and the Near East had given him the specific technical skills needed to record complex ancient architecture with accuracy and with the specific quality of detail that archaeological illustration requires. He would produce, in the 2 expeditions he made with Stephens, some of the most important archaeological illustrations in the history of American antiquity, drawings of Copan and Palenque and Uxmal and Chichen Itza and dozens of other sites that were, for many decades, the primary visual record of Mayan architectural achievement available to the wider world. They went first to Copan, the great classic Maya city in what is now western Honduras, whose stele, the tall carved stone monuments on which the Maya recorded the histories and genealogies of their rulers, are among the finest examples of Mayan sculpture in the world. They found it as most of the classic Maya sites were found in the 19th century, buried in jungle, its monuments covered in vegetation, its plazas filled with the accumulated debris of centuries of forest growth, the carved faces of the stele emerging from the undergrowth with the specific quality of discovery that the Victorian explorers found so intoxicating. Stevens bought the site. He paid $50 to the local landowner for the ruins of Copan, one of the most extraordinary real estate transactions in the history of archaeology, the purchase of a city for $50, intending to disassemble the carved monuments and ship them to New York for display. The river proved too shallow for the barges he needed and the plan failed, which is possibly the best thing that ever happened to Copan. His accounts of the two expeditions, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas and Yucatan, published in 1841, and Incidents of Travel in Yucatan, published in 1843, were the most widely read works of American travel writing of the decade. The combination of Stevens's vivid prose and Catherwood's precise illustrations introduced the ruins of the Maya world to the American and European reading public with the specific impact of a revelation. Here, in the jungle of Central America, were monuments comparable in scale and sophistication to the great monuments of the Old World, built by a civilization whose existence the educated public had known almost nothing about. Stevens's great insight, the insight that distinguished his interpretation from the prevailing European view, which preferred to attribute the ruins to lost Phoenicians or wandering Egyptians or any other Old World civilization rather than to the indigenous Americans who had obviously built them, was the specific observation that the ruins were the product of the people who lived there. He argued, against the pseudo-scientific racism of his era, that the ancestors of the living Maya had built the cities he was exploring, and that the specific continuity between the archaeological monuments and the living culture was the most important evidence available for understanding both. He was right. He was right in 1841. And his rightness was consistently ignored by the archaeological establishment for decades. The decipherment of the Mayan script is one of the great intellectual detective stories of the 20th century, a story involving multiple scholars across several generations, multiple false leads and incorrect theories that retarded progress for decades, and the specific breakthrough insights that came, as they often do in science, from people working outside the established consensus. The first major obstacle to decipherment was the theory promoted by the most influential Mayanist of the first half of the 20th century, Eric Thompson, a British archaeologist whose dominance of the field was so complete that his interpretation of the Mayan script as exclusively ideographic, representing concepts rather than sounds, was essentially the official position of Mayan archaeology for 3 decades, and whose personal authority was sufficient to suppress the alternative views of scholars who disagreed with him. Thompson was wrong. The Mayan script is not exclusively ideographic. It is logosyllabic, it represents both concepts and sounds, and the specific proof of this came from a young Soviet scholar named Yuri Norizov who, working in Leningrad in the early 1950s with a copy of the document that Diego de Landa had produced 4 centuries earlier, demonstrated that the Mayan script worked on phonetic principles that could be deciphered using the comparative method. Norizov was dismissed by Thompson and by most of the Western Mayan establishment, partly on scholarly grounds and partly, one suspects, on the specific Cold War political grounds that made a Soviet scholar's contributions to American archaeology professionally inconvenient in the 1950s. He was right and they were wrong, and the subsequent history of Mayan decipherment has vindicated him completely. The specific breakthrough that unlocked the historical content of the Mayan inscriptions came in 1960, when the Russian-American scholar Tatiana Proskoryakov demonstrated that the inscriptions on the Mayan stele were not astronomical or religious texts but historical narratives, records of the births and accessions and military victories and deaths of specific Mayan rulers, recorded with the specific pride of a civilization that understood history as the record of individual human achievement. This was revolutionary. The prevailing view of the classic Maya, peaceful astronomer priests conducting astronomical observations from their jungle temples, was replaced by a more complex and more accurate picture of competing city-states ruled by warrior kings whose political history was recorded in the hieroglyphic inscriptions on their monuments. The Maya were not peaceful astronomers. They were also fierce warriors, ambitious builders, complex politicians, and the subjects of human beings with the full range of human qualities. The generous and the cruel, the intellectually curious and the politically ruthless, the artistically inspired and the administratively pragmatic. The decipherment accelerated through the 1970s and 1980s as the generation of scholars trained in the phonetic approach, using Norizov's method and Proskouriakov's historical framework, worked through the corpus of Mayan inscriptions. Names began to emerge from the stone. Dates became specific historical events. The dynastic histories of Palenque and Copan and Tikal and Calakmul, cities that had been mute archaeological sites for over a century, began to speak in the specific voices of the rulers who had commissioned their construction. The Ladar revolution of the 21st century has been the most recent and the most spectacular transformation in the understanding of the Maya world. Ladar, light detection and ranging, a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to map the ground surface beneath forest cover, has revealed, in the past decade, a Mayan world vastly larger and more densely populated than anyone had previously imagined. The 2018 Ladar survey of the Guatemalan lowlands, the most extensive archaeological Ladar survey ever conducted, covering approximately 2,100 square kilometers of jungle, revealed more than 60,000 previously unknown Mayan structures, including pyramids, palaces, elevated highways connecting cities across the lowland jungle, irrigation canals, agricultural terraces, and defensive walls and ditches surrounding urban centers of extraordinary size. The survey revealed that the classic Maya lowlands were not a series of isolated cities in a largely empty jungle but a densely settled landscape in which the space between known cities was filled with smaller settlements, farms, and infrastructure that conventional ground-level archaeology had completely missed. The classic Maya collapse, the abandonment of the great southern lowland cities between approximately 800 and 1000 CE, is one of the most extensively studied events in Mesoamerican archaeology. The causes are complex, interrelated, and still actively debated, a combination of prolonged drought, revealed by the paleoclimatological evidence from lake sediment cores, political fragmentation, military conflict between the competing city-states that intensified in the century before the collapse, soil degradation from intensive agriculture, epidemic disease, and the specific failure of the political and religious systems to manage the crisis produced a collapse that was both rapid and comprehensive. The cities were not abandoned to permanent emptiness. The Yucatan cities of the north, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Mayapan, continued through the post-classic period and remained occupied until and after the Spanish conquest. The southern highlands of Guatemala maintained Mayan civilization continuously through the post-classic. The specific regional variation in the timing and the completeness of the classic collapse, some cities emptying rapidly, others persisting at reduced population for centuries, suggests that the collapse was not a single event but a cascading failure of the interconnected systems of the southern lowland Mayan world. The Spanish conquest, which reached the Yucatan in the 1520s and was not fully complete until the conquest of the last independent Mayan kingdom, Tayasal in what is now Guatemala, in 1697, was the most catastrophic event in the history of Mayan civilization. The epidemic diseases that preceded the military conquest killed between 70 and 90% of the Mayan population in some regions. The destruction of political structures, religious institutions, and written records was systematic and deliberate. The forced labor and the specific economic and cultural violence of colonial rule continued for 3 centuries. And the Maya survived. 7 million people. 32 languages. Continuous cultural traditions. The corn still planted by the ritual calendar. The ceremonies still performed. The memory still held. They were never lost. They are here.